How does he do that with his foot? The question came from the side of the stage, spoken quietly, directed at no one in particular, more thinking out loud than asking. The man who said it was 31 years old, a professional drummer who had been playing for 15 years, who had opened for some of the most significant acts in British rock over the previous 3 years, and who had spent the last 40 minutes watching John Bonham play a concert from the best possible vantage point. The stage left wing, close enough to see everything, far enough not to be noticed. He was not watching the show. He was watching Bonham's right foot. His name was Terry Calvert. He had been asked 6 weeks earlier by the promoter whether his band would open for Led Zeppelin at a venue in the north of England in March of 1969. He had said yes without needing to think about it. Not because of the exposure, though the exposure was real and worth having, but because the opportunity to watch John Bonham play for 40 minutes from the side of the stage was, for a professional drummer in March of 1969, the equivalent of a masterclass that no institution was offering and no amount of money could otherwise buy. He had prepared for it. He had listened to Led Zeppelin's debut album, which had been out since January, repeatedly and with the specific analytical attention of a musician trying to understand what he was hearing, rather than simply responding to it. He had played drums for 15 years. He had absorbed the language of the instrument from records and from proximity to other drummers, and from the specific education of playing professionally across a range of contexts. Dance bands, beat groups, the gradual shift toward the heavier, more amplified sound that was developing in the British rock world across the late 1960s. He was, by any honest assessment, a very good drummer. He had worked consistently throughout the mid-1960s, built a small but reliable reputation in the Northern England circuit, and had accumulated enough professional experience to understand the difference between playing well and playing at an exceptional level. He had heard exceptional. He had heard Charlie Watts. He had heard Ginger Baker. He had heard Keith Moon. He understood what separated the top of the available range from the middle of it, and he understood where he sat in that range with the unsentimental clarity of someone who has been honest with himself about his own abilities for long enough that the honesty no longer requires effort. What he heard on Led Zeppelin's debut album was something that did not fit his existing framework without qualification. The power was the first thing, the sheer physical force that came through the recording, even on a domestic record player, a quality that suggested the original sound in the room had been of a size that most recording technology of the period was not fully capable of capturing. But power alone was not the interesting thing. Ginger Baker was powerful. Keith Moon was powerful in a different way, chaotic and instinctive and explosively unpredictable. Bonham's power had a different quality from either of them. It was not chaotic. It was controlled in a way that made the force seem larger rather than smaller, the way a precisely directed blow is more effective than a wild one. But the control was not stiffness. There was a looseness in it, a physical ease that suggested the force was being generated without the kind of tension that most drummers at this level of volume produced in their bodies. He had played through various passages on his own kit, trying to replicate what he was hearing, and had found that what he was producing, while technically accurate as far as he could tell, was missing something he could not locate by listening more carefully or playing more forcefully or adjusting his timing. The missing thing was in the sound itself. The quality of the attack on the bass drum, the way the note spoke, the initial transient, and the way it decayed, and the way that decay related to what came immediately after it. The bass drum on the album had a quality that he had never heard from a kick drum before, a combination of definition and weight that seemed to contradict each other in theory, and coexist in the recordings in a way that was, the more he listened to it. He could hear that the thing existed. He could not produce it. He could not account for it. He arrived at the venue in March of 1969 with 6 weeks of failed attempts behind him, and a specific question forming in the part of his mind that sat closest to the instrument. The concert began. Terry stood in the stage left wing. For the first song, he was watching the whole band. the way the four of them moved together, the relationship between what Page was doing and what Bonham was doing, the way Jones's bass sat in the same frequency range as the kick drum without the two of them ever competing, the way Plant moved across the stage as if the music were a physical environment he was inhabiting, rather than a performance he was delivering. All of this was worth watching. All of it was instructive. By the second song, his eyes had moved to Bonham's right foot. What he was watching, from the stage left wing of a venue in the north of England in March of 1969, was something that had been obvious in principle since he first heard the album, but that was not obvious in observation. Bonham's right foot, the foot on the bass drum pedal, was doing something that Terry had not seen a drummer do in 15 years of watching drummers. The technique of bass drum playing in 1969, across virtually all of British rock music, operated on a set of assumptions that had been established by the physicality of the instrument and the pragmatics of the rhythms being played. The bass drum was a large instrument, requiring a large muscle group to operate. It was played with the whole leg, a heavy, full-leg stroke, driving the beater into the drumhead with the kind of force that generated the thump and sustain that rock music in the 1960s required for its bottom end. This technique produced a characteristic sound, full, heavy, slightly slow in its attack, with a decay that was generous, because the large muscle group driving the stroke was not built for the rapid repetition that would require immediate rebound. You could play fast on a bass drum with full-leg technique. You could not play the way Bonham played. Bonham was playing with his heel up, not his whole foot flat on the pedal board, not the heel-down technique that jazz drummers had developed for a different kind of sound. He was playing with the heel elevated and the weight concentrated on the ball of the foot, using the ankle as the primary point of articulation rather than the knee. This was not a new technique in any absolute sense. It had been used in various forms by drummers in other contexts. But what Bonham was doing with it, the specific combination of ankle-driven speed, physical force generated through the relationship between the ankle and the weight of the leg above it, and the particular quality of beater attack that this combination produced, was something that Terry had never seen applied to rock music, in this way and at this tempo and at this volume. He understood, watching Bonham's foot for the second and third and fourth songs of the set, several things simultaneously. He understood why the bass drum sound on the album was not reproducible by replicating the rhythms, because the sound came from the technique, and the technique was not what he had assumed it was when he was listening at home on his domestic system. He understood that what he had been trying to replicate on his own kit was correct in terms of what notes were being played, and incorrect in terms of how they were being played. That the attack he was missing was a function of this specific relationship between the ankle and the pedal, and the beater and the head, and that producing it would require him to retrain the muscle memory of 15 years of full leg playing. He understood that the sound Bonham was producing was not achievable in any other way, that it was not an accident of recording or amplification, but a specific physical solution to a specific acoustic problem developed through a process that must have involved years of experimentation and must have departed at some early point from the conventional approach in a direction that no one was teaching. He watched for 40 minutes. He asked his question, how does he do that with his foot? To no one in particular, not because he didn't want an answer, but because the answer was already visible to him by that point, and the question was a form of astonished recognition rather than a genuine inquiry. After the concert, Terry made his way backstage through the specific social geometry of a post-show environment. The orbit of the headlining band and their entourage at the center, the support acts and the crew and the promoters' people at the edges. He was not trying to get to Bonham. He didn't have a specific thing he needed to say. He was moving through the space in the way of someone who is still in the middle of processing something and needs to be somewhere while the processing continues. He found himself near the stage door at the same moment Bonham was moving toward it. They were within speaking distance for approximately 30 seconds. Terry said, and he told this story to other drummers for the rest of his life, always with the same quality of slightly disbelieving clarity about his own words, that he heard himself say, "I was watching your foot all night." Bonham stopped. He looked at Terry with the expression of someone who has been looked at a certain way before and knows what it means. He said, "Which one?" Terry said, "The right one." Bonham said, "Heel up." 2 words. Terry said afterward that these 2 words contained more useful information than any drumming instruction he had received in 15 years of professional playing. Not because heel up was a secret or a revelation. The technique existed, people had used it, but because hearing it from Bonham, in the context of what he had just watched for 40 minutes, collapsed the distance between the observation and the understanding. Heel up. That was the mechanism. That was what his ears had heard for 6 weeks, and his eyes had seen for 40 minutes, and his brain had been circling without landing. He went home and spent 3 months relearning the bass drum. He said it was the most difficult thing he had ever done on a drum kit, because the muscle memory of full leg playing was so deeply embedded after 15 years that overwriting it with ankle-driven technique required a sustained, uncomfortable period of regression, a period where his playing was, by his own assessment, worse than it had been since he was a teenager. He would sit at his kit and attempt a simple passage that he had been playing cleanly for a decade, and the new technique would interrupt the automatic execution that 15 years had made available, inserting a conscious decision where a reflex had previously been. And the result was the halting, effortful quality of a beginner rather than the fluid competence of an experienced professional. He stayed with it. He stayed with it because the sound he heard in his own kick drum, when the technique was working even imperfectly, was different enough from the sound he had been producing for 15 years to justify the 3 months of regression. The attack was different. The relationship between the beater and the head was different, not just louder or softer, but different in the quality of the transient, in the definition of the initial strike relative to the decay that followed it. He was hearing something in his own playing that he had not been able to produce before, and the fact that it was currently surrounded by technical difficulty and inconsistency was beside the point. The possibility was there. He needed time to reach it. By the end of 3 months, his bass drum had changed, not to Bonham's level, which was not a realistic target, and which Terry would not have described as a target even if it had been realistic, because the goal was not to become Bonham, but to understand and apply a principle that Bonham had made visible in 40 minutes from a stage left wing in March of 1969. He had gone looking for a mechanism and had found one. The music he made afterward was not Bonham's music. It was still Terry Calvert's music, but the foundation it stood on had shifted in a direction that the previous 15 years of playing had not been pointing him toward, and the shift was audible to the people who knew his playing well enough to notice. Terry Calvert continued performing for another 12 years, retiring from professional drumming in the early 1980s, when the economics of the music industry in which he had built his career shifted beyond the point of sustainability for acts of his level. He became a drum teacher in Leeds. He taught for 27 years in a small studio that he set up in the back of a music shop, working with students who ranged from complete beginners to semi-professional players trying to develop specific aspects of their technique. He was, by the accounts of the people who studied with him, an exceptionally precise and patient teacher, someone who understood both the technical and the embodied dimensions of drumming, who could diagnose problems in his students' playing with a specificity that came from having spent decades being precise about his own. He taught every student who came to him, at some point in their lessons, the difference between heel down and heel up bass drum technique. He described the difference in technical terms, in acoustic terms, in terms of what each approach made possible and what each approach closed off. He was not evangelical about it. He did not insist that one approach was superior in all contexts, because it wasn't. he taught both. But he taught the heel-up technique with a specificity and a conviction that came from somewhere that pure technical instruction didn't fully account for. He always began this section of the lesson the same way. He told the story of a concert in the north of England in March of 1969, of standing in the stage left wing and watching John Bonham's right foot, of the 40 minutes that restructured 15 years of assumption, and of the 2 words spoken at a stage door that sent him home to spend 3 months relearning something he thought he already knew. 2 words: heel up. Today, the heel-up technique is standard in rock drumming to a degree that makes it impossible to fully imagine a world in which it wasn't. A world in which the bass drum sound of Led Zeppelin was genuinely mysterious to professional drummers watching from the wings. Terry Calvert's students are, by now, teaching their own students, passing on a lineage that traces back to a stage door conversation in 1969 that lasted 30 seconds and contained 11 words. 2 of which did all the actual work. If this story of what it looks like when mastery makes itself visible to the people capable of seeing it moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. We share these stories every week. And tell us in the comments, has a single observation ever restructured years of assumption for you? Drop it below.